Okay, well, look, today we're going to actually go through the three main areas that concern goat producers. First of all, drenches and how we use them judiciously. Secondly, avoiding high doses of worms by paddock management and coping with worms using nutrition and immunity. And then finally, planning for a low-risk property using diagnostics, animal monitoring, and integrating worm control into your annual management plan. Now, in other cultures where they don't have access to drenches, and this is Central Asia, they do keep a lot of goats and they have very productive goat herds. But because they don't have drenches, they have to manage them in ways that are sustainable so the animals don't get sick. And they usually do this by putting them into a central yard and then grazing them out in different places each day. And then they follow a migratory life cycle around the year so that they leave paddocks fallow for long periods of time before they return to them. And by the time the goats return to a particular paddock, the worm larvae have died out and they aren't exposed to high numbers. Now, this is current day Malaysia. I was over there beginning of last year, and they take the goats out and tether them in a different place each day. Now, that isn't consistent with Australian animal welfare standards, but it's a common practice in many places in Asia. Now, when we put goats behind a fence, we're actually tipping the scales in favour of the parasites, because we're forcing the goats to remain on country that's already contaminated with their own feces and has already given rise to large numbers of parasite larvae. So this is where we get the expression, the natural enemy of the goat is the fence. If goats can see a fence, it means that they're restricted in their movement. They cannot get away from the worms. So we have to turn that around and make the fence our friend and not our enemy. Now, just a little bit of an update on what's been happening in worms. This is a series of maps showing the barber's pole worm as recorded from submissions to our laboratory, just from sheep and goats. And I'm not sure if you can see, but the green dots show that there's no barber's pole worm recorded, all the way through to the red dots, which show almost 100% barber's pole worm. And if we look at the submissions from around Australia, these are shire averages. We can say in 2019 there's a bit of a mixture. There's a lot of mixed infections from both New South Wales and Victoria. And then we get into 2020 and there's also mixed infections, but a few there that don't have any barber's pole worm at all. All right, well, look, as you can see, after the second or the third year really of La Nina, we're seeing more and more barber's pole worm, and it's from really all over the sheep and goat producing areas of Australia, including places like Dirranbandi and Cunnamulla. And the last record that we put on the map was July 2023, and you can see all of those New South Wales and Northern Victoria and down around Gippsland areas and South Australia, they've all turned pure red because most of the worms that we're seeing in those areas have now turned to barber's pole. And that's a very strong indication that the climatic conditions that we've had over the past 4 years have been very, very suitable for barber's pole worms. And it's not just the coastal areas, lots of inland areas are now inundated with barber's pole worms. And that's the situation in New South Wales, where we had a lot of barber's pole worms in 2023. Now, they don't go away. They do remain for a while. Now, just before we go on to worm control, it's worth mentioning there is a MLA tips and tools on controlling lice and other external parasites in goats. I thought it was worth mentioning because even though we currently have no registered products, well, we've got Pestine for what it's worth, but diazinon is being taken off the market. The deltamethrin product that we used to use, Clout S, has been taken off the market. They're not available for goats anymore. So all of the goat lice products that are used are off-label. And so some are good, some are dangerous, and we really do need to have a bit of a navigation through it. But because it's all off-label, I won't go into it in detail here, but please feel free to contact me if you want to know more about this matter. Okay, well, let's look in more detail now on the subject of drenches and goats. The first thing I just want to share is this research study that was done at the University of Adelaide Vet School, and it was published in 2022. And what they did was they looked throughout the world to find all of the different studies that have been done to look at the efficacy of different drenches in goats. And they came up with this summary that 100 different studies from all over the world, none of the products work very well. Now, this is no surprise to anyone who's been using drenches in goats anywhere in the world recently. They may still work in places like Africa and Central Asia where they're not used very often, but in all of the developed countries, the goat worms have developed very strong resistance to the drenches. Now, it's simply, again, a factor of the goat's metabolism and the fact that they have very, very strong livers that break down the drenches very rapidly, metabolize them, and get them out of the body before they have a chance to kill the worms. The only real hope we've got on the horizon there are the combination drenches. Now, there's lots of different combinations, and some of them may work, but the single-active drenches in general tend not to work very well. The other thing we have to always remember is that even though there have been pour-on drenches registered for goats in other countries, particularly in France where it was needed for dairy goats, they don't work anymore. And the trials that have been done both in Australia, University of New England, and overseas now show that these drenches are not very effective simply because the pour-on doesn't get into the goat's bloodstream and get distributed to where the worms are. The other thing we've always got to remember is that there's a danger in using drenches for goats, particularly in young goats. And the summary that was given by Dr. Lindsay Hamilton for Animal Health Australia and published in the Worm Boss newsletter is that naphthalphos, which is an organophosphate, is very dangerous for sheep, dangerous for goats. Ivermectin is particularly dangerous for young animals. So any animal that's under 15 kilos, it can potentially cross the blood-brain barrier. And since a lot of products do contain ivermectin, including Q-Drench and StarTech, we need to be very cautious about using that in young animals. Now, what happens is they'll actually have a comatose sort of reaction, and they'll go and lie down in the paddock, and they'll often die from exposure. Levamisole as well is in a lot of combination products. And 3 times overdose will kill goats, particularly any age goats. Placental is also in a couple of different products and causes blindness, loss of appetite, wobbly gait, weakness, and death. And albendazole. Now, this has been reported in the literature, and I hadn't actually seen it until just this year when we saw lambs that were overdosed on albendazole, and we had out of about 400 lambs, 3 of them died and others were sick for about 4 days. So even albendazole does seem very safe, but can actually cause toxicity as well. So we need to be careful when we're using the drenches. Then The other issue, of course, is residues, and even though Angora goats are fibre animals, they are regarded from a regulatory perspective as being a food animal, and therefore they will have they're subject to the same laws and regulations as other food animals. And so testing on goat meat residue, we are part of the larger goat industry, which includes goat meat, shows that up to 3% of samples from goat meat in a single year have tested positive above the maximum residue limits, which means that importing countries can actually reject shipments of Australian goat meat. That would be very unfortunate. Okay, well, let's look at healthy goats with nutrition and immunity. So the first thing is we are talking about having resilience in drought conditions, for example, and also I know for many producers in flood conditions. And because of that, we need to actually define what those words resilience and resistance mean. When it refers to worms in goats, the resilience means the ability to cope with worms. Now, this is manifest in many different ways, but it means that goats remain healthy, they have good gum colour or eye colour, they'll continue to produce lots of fibre, and they won't become sick, even when they've got fairly large worm burdens. Now, that's a distinctly different trait from resistance, which is equivalent to immunity, and it means the ability to kill off worms. So when the goats go into the paddock and pick up worms, they're able to use their immunity to actually kill many of the worms that come in. Now, we can select for both of those traits, they're genetic traits of goats, but we have to select for them differently because even though there's a fair bit of overlap between them, they're not the same things. Okay, well, let's look at how we can apply this to our own flocks or herds. Well, the first thing is we can feed for resilience. Now, goats respond very well to supplementary feed in an effort to help them cope with worms. It won't always cause immunity, but it will help them cope with worm burdens. And one of the best trials which demonstrated this effect was in Mexico in Pelibui hair sheep, which are like Dorpers, and they're very similar in their behaviour and metabolism to goats. What the researchers did was they gave all these lambs the same dose of barber's pole worms, but they fed them in 3 different levels. So the trial was set up like this: 3 different paddocks of lambs, and one was given enough feed, about 3% of their body weight each day, to allow them to grow at 75 grams per head per day. The second group was given 3.3% of their body weight, and that meant that they were growing at 125 grams per head per day. The third group were given 3.7% of their body weight, which meant that they were growing at 200 grams per head per day. Now, it might seem like only subtle differences in the amount of feed, but you can see that it had a big impact on their average daily gain, so the amount of weight that they gained on a daily basis. Now, when they gave them 10,000 barber's pole worms, they gave them twice. Over the course of the next month, they measured the amount of worms in their feces, and they found the better nutrition lambs had less worms and less worm eggs. So at day 21, the lambs on the highest level of nutrition, their worm egg count was 550, but on the lowest level of nutrition, 2850. Go to day 25, and there's a similar difference. The lambs on the lowest nutrition went all the way up to 7,900, whereas those on the highest nutrition were 925. And at day 28, the impact was the same. The lambs on the highest level of nutrition had a worm egg count of 625, and on the lowest level of nutrition, 7,000. So this is a great way of improving the resilience of the goats against worms. When we look at the actual packed cell volume, or hematocrit, which measures the percentage of the lambs or the goat's bloodstream that's made up of red cells, we can see because the Barber's pole worms are sucking blood, the red cells in the body are going down 7, 14, 21, 28 days, particularly in the lambs on the lower level of nutrition. But the ones on the higher level of nutrition maintained pretty good blood level. So hematocrit, or packed cell volume, is very closely related to the Pharmachar score, which we'll talk about in a minute. The next thing about nutrition is looking at sward height. And as I mentioned before, in those ancient pictures from the Vatican, the goats like to put their heads up. They like to graze things that are up high. And that's because they know that in a typical grass pasture, the majority of the worms live either in the top centimetre of soil or the bottom 5 centimetres of the grass sward. And so they don't preferentially put their head down and graze where the most of the worms are. They like to be up high, and they like to graze up on the tips, which shows that they know that very few worms actually get up to the top of the sward, and only maybe 1% or less of the worms in a typical pasture make it up to that top part of the sward above 15 centimetres. And again, when goats are forced to eat close down to the ground, they don't have any options. So if you put out feed on the ground for them to eat, then they'll inevitably be picking up higher worm burdens than if we let them out to eat trees, or to take the tips off shrubs like they like to do. So what the dairy industry does is they put goats into dry lots or feedlots, which means there's no pasture there for them to eat, and that means there's very little worm survival on the ground. The worms just die in the dust instead of crawling up the pasture for the goats to eat. When you're managing 1,000 head or more of goats, and they're producing milk for human consumption, and so it's very difficult to actually give them drenches, then that's the main option that people have taken to remove the goats away from the worms. And so that can be incorporated into our management practices as well, where we bring the goats in for intensive management, might be for security reasons as well, keep them away from foxes or other predators, and then let them out into different places during the day to graze. Now, if we look at the Meat and Livestock Australia going into goat manual, we can see that the nutritional needs of the goats are very clearly outlined there. And of course, on Thursday, Andrew, who's a professional nutritionist, will be giving us a very thorough run through of the requirements of goats. Now, Georgia, just tell me if you can see full screen now.
That's a no, sorry.
That's a no? All right, I'm going to exit again. Okay, so in the Going into Goats manual, there's very clear guidelines about assessing how much feed is in a paddock and how long, how much nutritional content you have, and you can measure it in kilograms and work out how long it's going to feed a particular mob of goats. Now, particular needs for kidding paddocks are that because during the period around kidding and lactation, they call it the periparturient relaxation of resistance, because parturience means kidding, And around that time, the goats lose a lot of their immunity to worms, and that's because they prioritise putting energy into the placenta so it can go into the kids, and then, of course, putting a lot of energy into the bag so that they can lactate and feed the kids once they're born. And that means that we need to prepare kidding paddocks that are as clean as a whistle, because any worms that are on those paddocks are going to multiply, grow, and cause havoc in our females. Similarly with weaners. Weaners are born with very little immunity to worms, and they don't develop any immunity to Barber's pole worms, for example, until they've had 12 weeks of constant exposure. And so it's usually only when they're 6 months or older and they've had exposure over a long period of time that they do start to develop some immunity. But immunity to brown stomach worm, for example, is even slower and may take several years, and it's never complete. Same goes for black scoureworm, the other major worm that we see in goats. So for weaners, we need to prepare low-risk paddocks. We need adequate nutrition, either from the paddock itself, but again, in drought situations, we may need a supplementary feed. And when they go into the weaning paddock, give them an effective treatment. So we need to add extra feed for growth, pregnancy, lactation, any deficiencies that they may have. And I've made a note there about protein, because adding protein in the form of, for example, lucerne hay or lupins or some other high-protein source can work wonders for improving resilience against worms. Now, again, you can go to this other tool on the Meat and Livestock Australia webpage, and that is the Australian Feed-Based Monitor, to help you get a bit of a handle on how much feed is in the paddock. Now, if you get one of these little rulers, which I use on a regular basis, you can pop it in the grass and work out how high the grass is, what colour it is, and you can pretty much work out the number of kilojoules of dry matter that are available for the animals to eat. Okay, well, let's talk about genetics, and particularly about selecting goats for resistance. Now, in this usage, resistance means immunity to worms. We've got a shot of the lab there because the main way that we do this is by doing worm egg counts and selecting the animals that have the lowest worm egg counts. Now, fortunately, on the gateway, we have this report, Selecting High-Performing Angoras by Mark and Bruce. It was written a few years ago, but it's another really useful tool for genetics. It's definitely not my area, so I won't talk any more about this, except to say that through our lab, we do a lot of testing for genetic selection of different types of livestock. Not so much for these rangeland goats, because people sort of accept what they get, but if they're improving rangeland goats by adding genetics from boars or other improved genetics, then they'll definitely use this sort of tool, Breeding for Worm Resistance in Goats, on the Worm Boss website, that helps them improve both the resilience and the resistance of goats to worms. And there is a KID plan as well within the Sheep Genetics website that gives you greater confidence in being able to have genetic selection that will have long-term benefits for your goat herds. Okay, well, let's look at signs of worms in sheep and goats. And again, Worm Boss has got a very good section on this. But we can start by saying, well, scours. I know these aren't goats, but we do see loose feces coming down out of the backside and often staining the flanks, the sides, the back end of the goats. So that's one sign. It's particularly seen in black scour worm and in brown stomach worm. In contrast, the main sign that we see in barber's pole worm relates to blood loss. And so this bottled jaw, where we see soft fluid swelling under the jaw of the goats, relates to blood loss and the fact that there's less blood proteins circulating around, able to draw back tissue fluid into the veins and the lymphatic vessels. So this is a common sign not just of barber's pole worm, but also of liver fluke in the liver fluke areas. The other sign we'll see is when we look in the eye and apply the Pharmachar method to gently push in the eyeball and roll out the lower eyelid. And again, we're looking at the lower eyelid here. We're ignoring the third eyelid, which comes across because it has a cartilage in it, which draws the mucosa tight and blanches it. So we can't really get a reliable idea of how well the animal's coping with anemia. It's this lower eyelid that is the critical one. And when we look at the lower eyelid, we can see in barber's pole worm in particular, it goes very pale colour. And when we look at our goats, we can do a cross-section of the goats, pull them aside and score them using a chart, and that will give us a very good handle on how well the goats are coping with the infection. Now, I was very fortunate to be taught this technique by Gareth Barth and Jan van Wyk in Onderstepoort, and we had Francois Milan, who was the guy who actually originated, was the original inventor of this method. And the actual chart, the Pharmachar chart, is named after him, Fafa Milan chart. And it's important that you get the right place, and this shows the correct positioning of the hands, one thumb over the top eyelid, gently applying pressure to allow you to push the eyeball in. And once the eyeball's pushed in, you can again very gently evert the lower eyelid with your other thumb and have a look at the colour of that eyelid. Then you match that with the colour on the chart, and you can tell if the animal is quite anemic, where it's a very pale colour, or it's doing very well, which is a darker colour. Now, there are training courses to allow you to do the full training in the Pharmachar system, and along with the training courses, these colour charts are available. So depending on your area, you may have to speak with Dr. Sandra Baxendall, who covers Queensland and a lot of northern New South Wales, or in New South Wales, Dr. Kylie Greentree or Dr. Baron Squires in Victoria. And in other areas, there may be other trainers, but we'll have to make that clear. If you do want to get in touch with us, we can probably find them. Okay, and that brings us to setting up a low worm risk goat property. And I have to confess, I'm 61 now, and I've been a vet since I was 23. And I've always been interested in livestock, and I used to turn up on a farm, and I was really very focused on animal health, and I'd be looking at the animals and trying to work out the best way to get them into peak health. And after spending years doing this and talking to a lot of farmers, I realised that the farmers themselves, animal health is one of the important aspects that they need to stay in touch with, but they've also got a lot of other irons in the fire. And so I've changed my focus now to properties, to farm health, and trying to work with farmers to give them the maximum farm health, which includes the economics, the returns, the sustainability, all those aspects of a farm that helps them prosper and have healthy animals and good returns, whether it's rain, hail or shine, including in droughts. Now, the first lesson that we need to take on board is that most of the worms on a farm aren't inside the stock. They're actually lurking there in a grass. And I've often heard the term 80-20 rule apply to worms on a property. And that might be true for most of the places in higher rainfall, high stocking density areas. But once you get in a drought situation, the worms on the pastures tend to dry up and they die out. And prolonged drought, or simply goats in the more arid areas where it's continually dry, most of the worms are actually inside the goats. So this varies quite a lot depending on your situation. But the bottom line is paddocks become terribly contaminated with worm larvae. And we can get a bit of an idea of this by looking at the life cycle of the gastrointestinal nematodes, the barber's pole worms, the brown stomach worms, the black scale worms that cause the bulk of the problems in our goats. So we can divide the life cycle into two parts: the part that takes place on the ground or in the grass, and that's as short as 4 days. Under ideal conditions, when it's nice and warm, 27 degrees, 60% moisture, it's only 4 days from the time that the eggs hit the ground and hatch till they crawl out of the fecal pellets and onto the grass ready to infect the goats again. And then it's a fairly predictable 21 days before those worms turn into adults, mate and lay eggs, and the eggs appear in the dung again. Now, this 4 days under cold conditions, for example, might turn into 150 days, may take a very long time. But we do have a very important distinction to make between eggs on the grass and larvae on the grass. And that's simply because when the eggs of barber's pole worm hit the ground, if it's very cold, for example, if it's under 10 degrees, or if it's very dry, and they really do like conditions equal to about 2 days of rainfall, they won't hatch. So they have very specific requirements for hatching. It needs to be warm and it needs to be wet. If they don't hatch, then they die within 5 days. And so for barber's pole worm, we have a very effective environmental backstop that helps us to control worms in a lot of areas where it's cold or it's dry, and that gives us some relief from barber's pole worms. However, in places where we get continual or regular rain and it's fairly warm, above 10 degrees most of the time, we do not get any relief from the barber's pole worms, and they'll continue to hatch right throughout the year. Okay, the other thing is, once they've hatched, about 50% of the eggs that hit the ground actually make it through to this third stage larvae. And once they've turned into third stage larvae, they're actually much more robust, and they'll last for up to a year. So let's look at our annual program and get a bit of a handle on what we need to do to work out how many worms are on our pasture. And the first thing we can do is schedule in regular worm egg counts, because if we work out what the worm egg count of the mob is, then we know how many eggs they're producing. Now, there's a regional program for every region in Australia, and for smallholders who are more often set stocking, then there's a separate program as well for all regions of Australia. You just need to go to the Worm Boss website to find that. The other thing is it's very difficult to navigate some of these programs without an advisor, and you can actually find an advisor on the WormBoss website. And of course, for off-label use of drenches, which covers almost every single drench that goats get, then your vet is your best ally for getting you through those choices. Now, there's a lot of things that you know about your goats that the vet doesn't know, and that's simply because, you know, your experience is unique and valuable, and you retain most of that experience. But there's also a lot of things that your vet knows about goats that you don't, and that includes a lot of the diagnostic tests, the things they do to work out what's going on. And, of course, the regulations regarding off-label product use are very strict in Australia, and that's something that only the vet can recommend. Just getting back to the worm life cycle. So the Barber's pole worms, 5 days before they die, but the other worms can survive quite happily in the fecal pellets for up to 30 days before they get the right conditions for developing. Once the worms have developed into larvae, they can be on the grass for a very long period of time. And that is the critical stage for contamination and also for cleaning them up. Now, we did a bit of a run through of our database, and from the thousands of goats that we've tested over the last 15 years, we found that the mob average is 630 eggs per gram. Now, we have to take that with a bit of a grain of salt because it may not be typical. A lot of these goats were tested post-treatment. A lot of them were tested, you know, to work out if they needed to be treated, and others were tested just for monitoring. So we can't really say this was a random selection. However, it does give us a bit of an idea of what the average worm egg count is for mobs of goats in Australia. That's 630 eggs per gram. And that means for an adult goat producing a kilogram of dung, they're putting 630,000, each one is putting 630,000 eggs every day onto the pasture. So a mob of 100 goats is depositing 63 million eggs, worm eggs, per day onto pasture. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the scope of the contamination that the pastures get. And when the larvae get on the pasture, of course, this is a dewdrop on the pasture, and we're looking at larvae there. Each one's about 0.7 of a millimetre long, and each mouthful that the goat gets might have several of those in. There have been trials looking at the amount of contamination there is on pasture. And, of course, it changes through the seasons. This trial was done in Ireland, where animals start grazing in the springtime, and then through the summer the paddocks become very contaminated. We can see the red colour there shows that there's 12,000 larvae per kilogram of dry matter. And given that a goat will probably eat about a kilogram of dry matter every day, it's easy to see how goats can eat, you know, many thousands of larvae. We've done our own pasture larval counts around Camden, and the tops we saw were about 40,000 larvae per kilogram of dry matter. So it is possible to have really highly contaminated pastures that will just make the goats sick. Now, we do have an idea of how long the larvae last because we can look at the temperature and see how much metabolic activity these larvae have. At low temperature, there's not much activity, and therefore the larvae last a long time. But at high temperature, there's a lot of activity and they run out of energy very rapidly. Okay, that means that we can use these typical pasture contamination degradation graphs to estimate how long the worms are going to survive on pasture. These ones were put together from research trials done on Barber's pole worm, and you can see that At very high temperatures, 35 degrees, pasture larval survival isn't very good. In fact, after 90 days, there's almost none there. And even after only 30 days, only about 10% survive. However, in winter, when the temperature might be only 10 degrees, it takes a much longer period to get down to that 90% kill or 10% survival. In fact, it might be 6 months at 10 degrees for the numbers to decrease to what you would consider to be a safe pasture. However, it does give us the ability to manipulate pastures, manage pastures, so that we get minimal contamination. And there's a lot of other tools that we can use. So rotating with cattle and dry stock, worm egg counting, our bucks, of course. Barbavax has been trialled by many producers as a way of decreasing the worm egg output. Biowormer is a fungus that's added to feed, and particularly places where you have valuable animals that are set stocking, it can reduce the pasture contamination by 70%. Rotating pastures is probably the most common way of doing it. Spelling pastures for long periods, however, that does take them out of productivity. Doing a low stocking rate like they do out in Western New South Wales or Southwest Queensland. Short joining periods, and scanning and drafting your multiples and singles and dries. Now, that's often done for ewes and maybe not done as much for our does. Sowing pasture, of course, is a great way of breaking the worm life cycle because there won't be any worms on the new growth. And alternate grazing with cattle or even with horses also is a very effective technique. Alpacas, of course, are very smart because they go over in the corner and build a latrine, and the male alpacas will not contaminate the entire pasture. They'll only contaminate a little bit. And, of course, they also have the behavioural adaptation, which is they won't graze anywhere near the latrine because they know that's where the worms are and they want to graze clean pastures away from it. So grazing alternately with alpacas or sharing with alpacas can actually help. Making hay or silage takes away a lot of the worms and exposes the remaining ones to UV light and temperature down at ground level. Okay, well, let's move on to monitoring and worm egg counts. And the first point I'd like to make is that there's many laboratories that have undergone the Parabos WEC QA certification accreditation, and they are the commercial laboratories that are able to offer up services for producers on a paid basis. And so our lab has got that. We had 4 people from our lab actually do the certification, and we're very proud of the fact that we are now WEC QA certified by Parabos. Now, if you want to do that, it's not hard to do. You can actually do it yourself, even if you're doing worm egg counts by yourself. Just go to the Parabos page for WEC QA certification, and you can apply and have samples sent out so that you can do the certification yourself. Now, I mentioned before we've got a big database of samples going back nearly 15 years, and that's how we got the 630 average. But you can see we've had the sample averages go up and down, up and down, up and down, and we worked out that in wet years we get higher worm egg counts, in dry years we get lower worm egg counts on average. But even in the dry years, there's quite a few mobs there with worm egg counts up over 1,000. So we can have quite high worm egg counts even in dry periods. So let's look at a couple of examples of recent case studies, and these have all come from Angora goats from the last few months that have been tested through our lab. And this type of test is called a pooled test, and you can see the producer submits 5 samples from mob 1, 5 samples from mob 2, 5 samples from mob 3, and they're all pooled into a single count, and the average for mob 1 was 250, the average for mob 2 was 950, the average for mob 3 was 0, although they did have a bit of tapeworm. So that means this producer has got a pretty good handle on what's happening in the 3 mobs of goats on their property. The other thing is they get a larval differentiation done, and that tells you how many of those worms are the different species: barber's pole, small brown stomach worm, black scoureworm. And here's another mob where another producer tested 3 different mobs, 1,000 average, 100 average, and this mob here had an average of 9,350. And so we've sent back the report with a bit of a warning here, a visual warning that you probably do need to drench pretty soon, because 9,350 is very high, particularly for a pooled count, given that we do see a bit of variation within mobs. And the other thing is black scoureworms that make up the bulk of the worms in these samples are very low worm egg laying worms. They don't lay many eggs per day. Barber's pole might lay up to 5,000 eggs per day. Black scoureworm more likely to be 50 to 100. And so having a worm egg count of 9,350, mostly black scoureworms, means there's a lot of worms living in the intestines of those goats. So this is the other type of test we do, where each individual animal has its own worm egg count done. You can see that this producer, again, has taken 15 samples, some of them from young goats, some of them from breeders, and some of them from non-breeders. And they look to have pretty good worm control on this place overall. No nematodirus worms were detected, but fairly low worm egg counts and a lot of zeros in these 3 groups. This is another place that's submitted 2 separate mobs. The Texel sheep down the bottom are all 0, and the Angora goats up the top, there's 9 samples there, and their average is very low and a lot of zeros, showing very good worm control in these 2 mobs. Now this one shows slightly higher than average worm egg count, but the highest one's 1850, and fluke result is positive. So we usually like to see people treating for fluke at strategic times during the year. However, due to resistance in fluke pretty much throughout New South Wales and Victoria, we've got to be a bit circumspect about when and how to treat fluke. Now, there isn't a lot of hard data on this, but we do get good feedback from producers about which drenches currently work for fluke and which ones don't. So you may need to use one that you're not currently considering. Another mob of 15 goats, bit of variation between 0 and the highest is 250, but overall very good worm control because only low numbers of worm eggs in the samples. In contrast, this mob here had an average of 1,953, and like most mobs of goats, there's a lot of variation within the mob. This one had 0 eggs per gram. This one had 4,250. So if you went and did a Pharmachar test on each of the goats, you probably find that the ones with the lower worm egg counts had nice pink lower eyelid, and the ones with the high worm egg counts, like this one, 4,250 or 3,200, probably were starting to look a bit pale. This one again, fluke positive once more. The average is only 337 eggs per gram. Some of those animals will start to get a bit high, up to 900. But if you look at the species differentiation, the larval differentiation, you'll see that most of the worms here are small brown stomach worm. So 337 for small brown stomach worm is actually reasonably high. Now, if this was just growing animals, I'd be looking to get them onto a better plan of nutrition and hope that they, would be able to overcome it. If it was does that are approaching kidding, I'd be very keen to treat them because the brown stomach worms will reduce appetite and stop those animals from getting adequate nutrition. If it was mostly Barber's pole worm, we wouldn't be too concerned with this level. Now, if you want to do more work on interpreting worm egg counts and making decisions, then again, I'd refer you back to Worm Boss and the Drench Decision Guide because it does give you fairly good landmarks. And of course, it's not just the worm egg counts. We're also looking at the pharmachar, the body condition score, scouring, and other signs such as weight loss to make our drenching decisions. And this is a picture of the incubator where we put the samples from the goats and culture them for a week and then take them out and look at the third stage larvae under the microscope to see what they are. Now, once you've got information about the worm egg counts of the different mobs of goats, you can actually get a very strong indication of which paddocks on a property are wormy and which ones are low risk. And so even if you use a simple system like this, a traffic light system, you can put dots on the different paddocks and say, well, this paddock just had it was a kidding paddock, and so it's obviously going to be very wormy, and therefore we're not going to put lambs into there or weaners. We're going to put them into this low-risk paddock, which has had cattle grazing on it, and then it's been spelled for a long time. So you can make decisions about where to allocate the goats in different paddocks based on how wormy they are, not just on the agronomic principles. Now, that brings us to refugia, because if you look at worm egg counts on individual animals such as this one, you might say, well, let's draw a line in the sand and we'll say we'll drench any goat that's got a worm egg count of more than 1,000. And so we'll drench number 13, number 12, number 11, number 9, obviously, number 8. We'll drench these 4 up the top. So it looks like we're going to drench about half of them. And that way you can make a decision. That's called targeted selective treatment. And you might make the decision based on what some practitioners call a happy factor, which combines the worm egg count with the pharmachar score and any other signs such as weight loss, body condition score, or scouring. And you can determine, because each mob is genetically distinct, they have their own happy factor. So by doing that, you selectively treat some goats and not others, and you're naturally creating what's called refugia. And that means that there's some worms on the farm that aren't being treated, and so they contribute their susceptible genes to the next generation of worms. And if we do that all the time, then we'll have a lot slower selection for resistance. That's drench resistance. And I know in South Africa, what they do is they'll go up the race in places where they have a lot of Barber's pole worm, and someone will assess the sheep or the goats, and they'll only drench the goats that have very pale lower eyelid, and not the ones that have a nice pink one, because they obviously are resilient and they're coping. And that's what's meant by refugia, and that will help the drenches to last for a lot longer. Now, if you want to expand on the goat worm control program, you can actually look at this 360-degree program to help you look at all the different tools and tricks that are available to you. And that's a little program that was put out by Dorwitz for our clients that enables you to go through a little self-assessment, 25 questions, and by the end of it, you put your mark for each of these on the wagon wheel. And if you've got a big, nice round wagon wheel, it means you've got a very holistic approach to worm control. But if your wagon wheel's all spiky or if it's flat on one side, it means you've got areas that you can improve on and hopefully round out your wagon wheel so you have a nice smooth ride. Okay, now I'm just going to summarise by going through the do's and don'ts. So the first and the most fundamental thing is have a whole farm program that spells out times on the calendars for things like worm egg count testing, paddock rotations, and animal assessment. And in some situations, it might be every couple of days to do your pharmachar if the animal's under intense pressure from Barber's poleworms. Don't set stock paddocks. Don't just leave the goats in one paddock. Rotate, spell them between grazings. Observe your animals regularly, and that's all of the different things you can do, and respond to early signs. Manage your paddocks and use any means possible to minimise worm larval contamination. Don't use drenches unless under veterinary prescription, but do use drenches to control worms, particularly with targeted selective treatment. Use genetic selection to give your herd higher immunity, or also known as resistance. Supplementary feed to make up gaps in the goat's needs and boost resilience, especially in times of drought. Don't let goats lose body condition. Aim for an even score year-round. And the simple economics of that is that it takes goats about 2.5 times more energy to put on condition than to simply maintain it. And update your knowledge on parasites with Worm Boss, MLA going into goats, and of course your very own gateway. So with that, I'll leave you with an ad for Parabos. So you can go to Parabos to find out all about worms in goats. And I'll hand back to Georgia with my sincere apologies for the technology failure.
No, thank you very much, Matt. That was absolutely brilliant. And no, my apologies for the presentation issues there. I will get on top of them before our next viewing. But no, that was absolutely brilliant. And I'd like to open up the floor for anyone with a question. If you would use the little raise your hand button, that would save us all talking over each other if anyone's got any questions.
Is it easier to manage worms in drought or not?
I'll have to say yes, but I'll qualify it. Often in drought times, we're doing supplementary feeding, and animals are also missing out on nutrition. Their body condition score slips, and they may have lower levels of resilience. But the great thing about drought is that there's very few worms left in the paddocks. So you can actually get a good burn-off of the worms and have less pasture contamination, and therefore, less challenge for the goats.
So that's really a big link between tonight's presentation and Thursday's in terms of managing Angoras in drought conditions and trying to get the best out of them.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Just wondering about frosts and, sort of a past. I'm not sure whether it's still applicable or not, but, they used to say if you had, 4 or 5 frosts in a day, that it would reduce the number of larvae on the pasture.
Yeah, great question, Sue. And it all comes down to how well eggs and larvae survive cold weather. And so the eggs are actually very susceptible to frosts, and they won't hatch, they won't develop. And after a short period of time, 5 days for Barber's pole worm, 30 days for brown stomach worm, they'll just die off. However, the larvae are different. This time of year is actually very critical because any egg that develops in the autumn, when the temperatures are still, reasonably high during the daytime, and it's not just an average of the temperatures, it's actually, each hour, determines if the worm eggs are developing. They can potentially develop into third stage larvae, and then they're very robust. They do have a protective sheath over them, which is the cuticle from the second stage larvae, which they retain when they become third stage larvae. And that gives them quite a lot of protection from the environment. And I've been in places like Hokkaido in Japan, where Barber's pole worms will quite happily survive, even though they have, snow on the ground for 5 months of the year. And the same thing happens in places like Ontario in Canada and even in coastal Sweden. So all they need is for the eggs to develop through to larvae during the favourable conditions, and then they'll survive through the frosts.
Great. We're just in prime time at the moment because, today it'll be 1 in the morning going to 21 here. So they're going to be getting nice and strong.
Thank you, Sue. Jennifer, I think you're next.
Georgia, your mic's off.
Sorry. I was trying to tell Jennifer to unmute herself and unmute.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm wondering if they're going to do any testing on the drenches for the goats so that they are actually on label rather than off label and by prescription only through vets. There's a lot of drenches out there, but there's nothing that we can use on goats legally.
Yeah, it's a bit of a perennial issue, Jennifer, and the MLA project over the last year has looked at it, and I've heard the preliminary results, and the answer is, in a word, no. I do a lot of work with pharmaceutical companies, and they seem to be taking products off the market now rather than putting new ones on, and unfortunately it seems to be one way. So I think in the medium to long term, there'll be less drenches available for goats.
Okay, well that's not very promising. And another question is, what if the vets around you really aren't qualified for goats? They just, if it's a cattle area, they aren't up on the goat industry. They don't quite know where to start with it.
Yeah, it's a tough gig. It's one of the big challenges of the era. There's less and less vets working in the country for starters, and if they do specialise in one area and get busy, there may be little incentive for them to deal with another species. We do, though, have the benefit of technology, and I know vets like Dr. Sandra are able to do, online consultations, and there's also the Phone a Vet app. So you just go to the app called Phone a Vet, and they'll pair you with a veterinarian who can hopefully work out exactly what you need. But it's definitely not an easy situation at all for many goat producers, Jennifer. I really do empathise with that.
Yeah, especially if you're audited or anything like that, and you have to have all your ducks in a row with your prescriptions, etc.
Yes,
challenging.
it's not just logistically difficult, it can be an extra added expense as well, considerable expense.
Yeah, particularly if the vets in the area aren't knowledgeable for the goat industry, and it's just a sideline thing that they see dollar signs for. That's what's occurring around here.
Look, the encouraging thing is I do go to the sheep, camelid and goat veterinarians conferences, and there are some really great young vets coming out now. Maybe not from the traditional universities like where I went, Sydney University, but from the country-based universities, let me put it that way, like Wagga, Adelaide and James Cook University, who are fantastic. I call them small ruminant vets, but they're doing a really good job. So that's great to see.
Yeah, okay, that's good. We need a list of them available. Thanks.
Matt, do you mind if I ask another question?
Go for it, Grant.
Georgie, is anyone else with hands up? Given the challenges we have with drenches and treating worms, I suppose this question focuses on reducing the worm count in the paddock. What's your experience with rotating or multi-species grazing using cattle? What advice have you got for us on how we might implement that?
Yeah, there's a little bit of overlap between cattle and goats. The brown stomach worm from cattle will survive in goats, but not very well. And there is another worm which is related to the black scour worm, but it's actually a stomach worm. So the black scour worms in goats live in the intestine. This one just happens to live in the stomach, and it's called the stomach hair worm. It'll survive in both species quite well. But the bulk of the problem worms, if goats eat cattle worms, they don't care. They just kill them. They don't survive. And if cattle eat goat worms, they don't survive either. And so it's a great way to both spell your paddocks and also, they browse differently, they graze differently. So you use different species and you get greater utilisation of a paddock if you can get that multi-species rotation going.
Yeah, so I think that's just going to be a big topic in ongoing conversations for those who are joining us on the holistic management journey and the regen farming journey. Is how we try and apply some of these more natural methods to help us in management.
Yeah, good point. And just before we switch to the next question, you can't do it with sheep and goats because they just share too many worms. And so it really is you have to get away from another small ruminant. You have to, the alpacas maybe because of the latrine situation. Cattle definitely. Horses also very good.
Thank you. Some good guidelines there, Matt.
Can I ask a question? I've got my hand up.
Go for it.
Hey, Nalani.
Matt, thanks for the presentation. You sort of scooted over the top of Barbavax. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I know I've used it over the last 6-9 months and found it really effective. Can you talk about sort of how it works to start with? Because I'm not really understanding it. And is an ongoing usage sort of recommended, or do the animals sort of build up sort of such a resistance or in their own biology that maybe you can extend past the recommended time? Because I know I've definitely done that, and they seem to be really coping much better with the exposures at the moment. I mean, I've done some mineralisation on my paddocks as well, and I think that has definitely improved their overall health, which, as you demonstrated, if you've got better health in your animals, are going to be more resistant to worms overall. But I'm just really interested what your thoughts are on Barbavax in itself, but also as a long-term treatment process or method.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you raised it because it's another off-label treatment, and Geica have actually got a bit of a checkered history with Barbavax. I think they've put quite a bit of money into research and not had very reliable results. When they went to register Barbavax for goats in Australia, one trial went really well and the other trial didn't, and so they had to have 2 good trials to get it registered. That's why it's registered for sheep, and we know a lot about what Barbavax does in sheep, but not that much in goats. Now, having said that, I'm glad that you said you've had a good experience, because in sheep, on average, it reduces worm egg counts by about 70%, which is quite considerable considering, it's quite considerable when you look at the consequences of that, and that is a lot lower contamination of paddocks. And so it has the benefit, of course, in reducing worms in the goats, but also less contamination of the paddocks. And that, I think, is the major reason why people are using it in sheep so much. Now, it's great to talk about it, but I can't say that the results people are seeing in sheep will transfer over to any type of goats, let alone Angora goats. But I'm very, very glad that you've shared your own experience there, and I'd encourage you to keep on using and monitoring. The other part of your question, how long before you do the boosters? You have to give 3 shots before you get efficacy of Barbavax. Now, after that, it's considered that each shot lasts about 6 weeks. And so if you want to give boosters, you're doing them about every 6 weeks. But in a situation where you haven't got huge challenge, you might let them go out to 8, 10, 12 weeks before you boost again. So it is very much a, keep one hand on the reins and see how you're going. It's not definitely not paint by numbers. You can't just have a program that you stick by every year. You have to feel your way a bit.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to add, I enjoyed the presentation, and what I really picked up from it was I enjoyed the property map, where you had the traffic lights on the property map. That's something that I hadn't thought of doing, like as you do your fecal egg counts, actually starting to map it out. So I just wanted to make comment that I thought that was a good way, because that is one of the problems, like how many free paddocks do you have? And because we separate our animals sometimes on age and sex, you can't run your old bucks with your young bucks, and then you have your mating mobs. You start to run out of paddocks pretty quickly. But I thought the traffic light, that was very clear in my head how you could really map it out. So I appreciated that. So that was just what I wanted to make a comment on. So thank you.
Cheers, Nick.
Yeah.
Can anybody hear
Matthew,
me?
what about not so much pasture, but smaller shrub type food, like Pragates or even Leucaena up north, that sort of thing? That must help with worm control, wouldn't it? Because they're not eaten off the ground.
Yeah, exactly, Graham. Yep. It's a big help. And in terms of actual species, I'm afraid I'm not really very well qualified to comment, but I'd definitely be looking at anything like Leucaena that's a bit higher, because not only is it very high in protein, but it's up off the ground.
Like with fibre growing animals, you obviously have the veggie matter and all that, but Pragates, and that's a smaller tree that doesn't get into them. I think that's another avenue for good management, so to speak.
Michelle, have we got you now?
Just back at the beginning of the presentation, you're talking about stock rotation and using different paddocks. And this will probably, I'm thinking this may be covered in the next one on Thursday, but is there a recommended size, acreage of the paddock and number of animals per paddock?
Yeah, no, it has to be based on your own situation, Michelle. So if you've got 1,000 goats, for example, you're managing in mobs of 150, then you might want to have them in each paddock for 4 days and rotate them like that. But it's very much horses for courses. Every farm is so different that you need to make a plan based on your own individual situation. I wish I could help more, but there's no definite prescription there.
It's mainly just because we haven't got a lot of paddocks set up. We've just taken over from mother-in-law who passed away February last year. And, so we're starting from scratch. So if we're going to start petitioning off some paddocks, it'd be handy to know what size we should be. But we've got Graham.
Good.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and everybody for sticking around and asking so many valuable questions. They are brilliant, and it definitely helps me understand where everyone's coming from as well. So thank you very much, Matthew. And if anyone else needs to get in touch with Matthew or anyone that's been involved in the webinar, please get in contact, and I'm sure we can help you out.
And just one last word of on the admin side. Given that we've received the fair swag of money from the government, I hope you don't mind if I send out a questionnaire so we can get some feedback, and in terms of how we can improve things and where we might want to focus going forward, because there's a big program ahead. And certainly we'd like to introduce some of this content into some of our thinking going forward. And this is sort of one of the first foundational webinars that we'd like to start building from. But thank you everyone for attending and making the time. I see some of you sitting out there with beanies on and wrapped up in the cold. Thanks for putting your evening aside and joining us. Thank you. And thanks, Matthew. Once again, a very informative presentation and cut to the chase. A lot of the documents and published documents out there that us poor farmers need to try and wade through in shorter and shorter time periods we have available.
Thanks, Grant.
Great. Thank you, and see everybody Thursday.
Thank you.
Georgia.
All right. Good night.